Every so often in the garden, there's a plant that is a triple threat, something that's strikingly gorgeous, comes in all sorts of different colors. You can eat it, and it provides great habitat and food for wildlife. And of course, I am talking about this beautiful plant as well as many others around my garden, amaranth. This season I planted a ton of amaranth in the garden. I'm going to show you how to grow it in this video as well as how to harvest it for a bunch of different purposes, but it's a very cool plant. Amaranth, ancient Greek, meaning without exhaustion, or the immortal plant, named because these don't really wither away. They have a lot of staying power, which makes them great for bouquets, dry flowers, all sorts of different preparations, but we have to get into the fact that there's more than just this variety. There are 3 different types of amaranth in my garden, and this is probably my least favorite, but it's still quite striking. This is the burgundy variety. It is quite tall. I'm 6'4". This is about 6 feet tall, so it's putting up a nice fight against me, but it has more of a spiky style structure, very colorful, would be a great thing to plant maybe at the back of a border or just to add a little texture and height to the garden. But then you get to my second favorite over here, and this one is a coral version of the Love Lies Bleeding amaranth, and this has more of that weeping style that amaranth is really known for. I love how these fall. To me, that's the most exciting part about amaranth, just this structure here, all these little tiny flowers, all the seed in here, the color, especially when it's nice and bright in the morning or in the evening. I don't know, there's something about the structure of this plant that really gets me excited to plant more of it in the garden. But my favorite one is right over there. So here we have Love Lies Bleeding, probably the most classic amaranth variety you can find. This isn't just one plant, by the way. I have one here, there's one coming up right here, and another one back here, which gives it this nice kind of textured look. So here's my garden path, and every day I get to walk on through and see these sort of beautiful hanging guys just chilling out here. It just looks absolutely incredible. So we know the varieties, let's figure out how to get it started. So there are a couple ways to start amaranth. I'm gonna show you a little bit more of an intensive way first, and then the simple, basic way that I actually recommend. But I forgot about a variety. It's called Hot Biscuits. I don't know why we didn't plant this one. Maybe the name freaked us out a little bit, but it's a nice variety. It's more of that spike style, but kind of a caramel color instead of that deep burgundy. So try that one out if you like it. But let's talk planting. So these are very small seeds, extremely small seeds. You might even have a hard time planting them deliberately in something like one of our Epic 6-cell trays. So I tend to not recommend doing it, but if you're in a climate where you want to get a head start, then you kind of have to do this. So what I would recommend is just making a slight depression and then just tapping these in. So I like 7 just flew out right there, right? So they're very, very delicate. And then you want to barely cover them, just barely cover them. There we go. Just put like 3 down there. Roughly 3 is a good amount per cell. Cover them up, mist them, and keep them in a nice humid area where that moisture stays, and they'll start to sprout. And then of course you can transplant them back into the garden. But if you want my honest advice, what I would do is I would take a pack and I would take clumps of 3, maybe 5 to 7, whatever kind of comes out, make a depression in the soil, direct sow them. Don't go too deep. So you can almost scatter sow them on the surface of the soil and then cover them up with just a touch of compost. When that soil starts to warm up, then you can get into the thinning process, which is really how you unlock the power of the amaranth. So what you want to do when you are transplanting in your amaranth, take a look at this Love Lies Bleeding section I showed you earlier. So there's one plant right here. This entire structure right here is one plant. I have another one right here. And then there's a third starting right here. This one's a little bit more of a wimpy style. So you can tell, I mean, if you look at the actual stems, this is about 2 feet apart, and that's probably the spacing I would recommend if you don't prune your amaranth. So you can prune it and keep it a little bit lower, force it to bush out more. So take a look at this one right here. This is a good example of how it wants to grow if you don't prune it. You see one main stem, you see it coming straight up. It has some side shoots coming off, and those are, spreading out a touch, but it's really gonna focus on that vertical growth going straight up. And like I said, it can get quite tall. Or if you wanted to, I didn't do it in my garden this season, but you can do it this way. And this gets you a little bit better production of these guys if you want to grow them for cut flowers, dried flowers, is prune it lower earlier on. So you'll notice, much like you do with basil or some of these other plants that you want to get more bushy, is you can take the stem and you could prune it out right above a growth node and some of these offshoot stems will become the main stem. You just want to do that a lot lower after you transplant it in, and you'll get a much more bushy style structure. I wanted some height in the garden. I wanted this type of look that I think is really cool. I've got these guys hanging over here, same plant hanging over here. I really like that look. So I did not prune, but you totally could. Maybe you wanted to put it in a whiskey barrel. You just do that, prune it right about a foot or so of growth, and it'll bush out really nicely. And when you transplant, make sure you're transplanting in a warm soil. Give it a touch of organic fertilizer, not too much. It wants full sun, it wants a good amount of water, and it wants just your basic fertile, loamy style soil. I tend not to run into too many pest disease problems with my amaranth. You might run into some of the classic garden variety stuff like powdery mildew or whatever, but most of the time you're gonna have something like this. You're gonna have something ready to harvest. And there's really 3 reasons you would want to harvest your amaranth. The first would be if you're a cut flower person, if you love to have a flower, or even a dried flower person, well, here's one way to do it. You want to wait until you see nice color developing. So I see some decent color here. It probably could be a touch better, but for the sake of example, I'll show you this. And then what you want to do is come down and cut where you have some room here. So I'd probably cut about there or so. And you want these flowers to be 75% open. There's a ton of tiny little flowers on here. About 3/4 of them you want to be open. If you want to do it a dried way, well, what you can do is then trim off all of these and then hang dry them. So you can tie all of your amaranth in bunches, much like you would do with like drying peppers. We did that last year in the garden. It had like tons of dried peppers. You can just cut a little bit of this off and then dry this. Hang it upside down, warm, dry place, a couple weeks, it'll be nice and dry, and that color tends to stay quite a while. Remember, that plant is named Immortal for a reason. So that's one way to do it. But you might also want to harvest it for its grain or for its seed. So you can use amaranth as sort of a pseudo grain. I did it last year and I went through quite an arduous process to get all of the seeds out of this because it doesn't even look like there are seeds in this. What you have to do is rip off all these little puffs, kind of strip them off the plant. So let me actually move over to somewhere a little more clean. Okay, this is how you do it. The easiest way is to have some sort of surface. Even easier would be to put like a sieve or a colander down, and it would help you capture some of the seed more. But here's what you do. You want to strip it with your fingers, just like this, kind of like how you'd strip some herbs. And then what I do, especially if you're doing a small batch, is I come through and I just rub it between my hands, and that kind of breaks up all these little flowers and gets that seed out of there. But what you'll notice, this is the tough part about harvesting amaranth grains, why it's kind of an arduous process, like I mentioned, is you get a mixture of seed, which are these tiny, tiny little circle guys right there, and tiny little flowers. Both are pretty lightweight, but the seeds are heavier. So the secret here to really filter it out is to get it down into one corner, if it's a bowl maybe, and then you just lightly blow on it. And if you do it right, you've got this little corner full of seed. So this is an ancient process called winnowing. I'm not doing it in the most fancy way here. This is a pretty sort of traditional technique, I guess, but it works really well. So when you're winnowing other types of seed that are heavier and the chaff or the material you want to get away is lighter, you can actually just set a fan up. We did this with wheat a couple years ago with Jacques, but in the case of amaranth, the seed is actually almost as light as the flowers. So you have to be very careful. Very light wind will get rid of it. So that's the way to do it. You will then have a nice clean amount of seed, and you can use that sort of as like a cereal grain or a porridgey type of dish. The third thing you can do to harvest your amaranth or gain some extra value out of it after its beauty is starting to fade is actually nothing. It's my favorite thing to do, in fact. I like to leave it here and just let the birds go to town on it. Let the other animals go to town, because there are so many seeds, so much nutrition, right, in this plant. So you leave it here. I've got this one, a couple ones over there, and you start to see the birds, little guys, start to make a little nest in here maybe, or they will start to munch. They get a lot of extra nutrition. So it helps bring some more biodiversity back into the garden. That's what I focused on a lot in this backyard patch this year, is all of these pollinators, my native milkweed, my amaranth, some of my other flowers, my straw flowers, my zinnias. It all comes together so I can get my own value from it as a gardener, the beauty, the nutrition, and then leave some for the birds, the bees, and the other insects. So it's a fantastic plant, adds so much beauty to the garden. I think you should all be growing amaranth. If you want another plant that you think you should be growing, it's called alyssum, and there's a whole guide on how to do that right there. All seeds can be found on botanicalinterest.com. Good luck in the garden, and keep on growing.